What was your role in the presidential campaign and in the first year of Obama administration?
I had a very peripheral role in the campaign. I was a supporter. I campaigned for him. I was out gave a number of speeches for him. He was a friend of mine at the University of Chicago, and I obviously was a strong supporter. But I've not had any official role in the campaign other than offering advice where advice is sought.
What is the political stance of the American government on the internet freedom?
Well, in principle, the government's position is that they support internet freedom. And of course, they have stood up for internet freedom in the context of Google and other entities like that. But I think that there's no clear policy yet inside the administration about internet values. When you think about the different contexts of privacy, copyright, access, and broadband penetration. And I think that's something the administration still has to develop.
Google has been accused and sentenced by an Italian court for having allowed to display on YouTube a video where a few students were making fun of an handicapped boy. What do you think about it? In your opinion, providers must control the material posted in the net, and more than that, is that feasible or will it be feasible?
Well,
technically feasible.
It's not technically feasible to have an open internet which invites anyone to contribute creativity or commentary and have the network identify and filter content that might be objectionable to particular people. That's not technically feasible. So regulations like this and prosecutions like this will basically force that vision of the internet to shut down, at least inside of jurisdictions where the law is effective to control that behavior. So rules like this will force companies to choose where they can make certain internet services available and where they can't. And if this type of rule begins to spread, that would radically change the character of the type of creativity and innovation that's happening in the context of the internet right now. Well, it's not for me to be against Italian law.
Yeah.
But I will say that it seems to me inconsistent with principles of freedom that I understood were also part of Italian law. And it represents a picture of the future which is radically inconsistent with the vision of the internet that's being developed in other countries around the world.
Mr. Lessig, you wrote a very important book, Remix, where you write about the value of the sharing economy. You seem to believe that the internet is based more on sharing economy than on traditional market economy. And you envisage a kind of hybrid economies in the future. What do you exactly mean by hybrid economies, and do you think Europe is ready for that?
Well, I don't know whether sharing is more important than commerce on the internet. But I do think that the internet makes possible the sharing economy and encourages the sharing economy much more successfully than the same in the physical space. And businesses, to the extent that they can inspire their users or their customers to participate in adding value back to the business, that's what I call a hybrid, will be more successful, more profitable than businesses that fail to do that. Now, that view was the view expressed by Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer at a conference that I was at in the middle of 2007, where he said every successful internet business in the future will be, in this sense, a hybrid. So I think it's the natural direction the internet is going. How this works out, hard question. But if Europe is not ready for that type of development, then Europe is not ready for the internet.
Making business online in America is successful right now, and what do they offer, actually? What kind of goods and services?
Well, the internet is becoming integral in every part of regular commerce. So from buying books to buying clothes to buying electronics to buying tickets to making reservations to making even reservations for restaurants, it becomes increasingly the way in which you do commerce. And it increasingly ties commerce to social activities. So when we want to find a restaurant to visit, we use a site called Yelp, which is a social community that reviews and ranks sites and restaurants and other commercial sites like that. So the internet increasingly becomes the way in which we mediate commerce as well as engage in commerce. And of course it is successful in the sense that it's much more efficient and profitable to be engaging commerce like that than in the physical space, though obviously it's going to radically change the way commerce develops. We're going to buy different things in physical space from what we used to buy before. I don't think the real world's going to disappear anytime soon, but certainly we're going to depend much more on the type of commerce that happens inside of cyberspace.
According to you, what is the biggest area for the future in internet? The one of goods or the one of services? Ideas or goods?
But that's the point. These things are no longer separated. The goods are wrapped in ideas. So think about Amazon. Amazon isn't just a site that sells books. It's a site that gathers an enormous amount of information from users about the very things that they're trying to sell. And when you use Amazon, you're using the service of Amazon, which is recommendations and information about the stuff you want to buy, and you're using it as a site to gather goods. So these two separate worlds have now merged into one in the context of the internet.
What are, according to you, the three main threats to the internet freedom?
So,
3, 4, 5.
Well, I would say three.
Okay.
Government, and government. But in different senses. So number one, government, in the corrupt way in which existing commercial or monopoly interests use the government to protect themselves against the internet. So when they use the power of copyright legislation to increase their control over creative activities and resist the freedom of the internet. That's number one. Number two, when the government just has stupid regulations that block the development or the spread of the internet. So in the United States, we've had so far very bad regulations encouraging the deployment or development of broadband infrastructure, and we are way behind Europe in developing broadband infrastructure. And number three, government failing to regulate in places where I think it needs to regulate. So for example, security, cybersecurity, and the attack on malicious behavior, spam and malware. The government has been completely absent in that fight. And over the past 10 years, an enormous infrastructure of criminality has developed on the internet. And it makes the infrastructure extremely vulnerable to attack and exploitation. And that's simply because the government's attention has been elsewhere rather than focusing on what they should have been focusing on.
Is really that the United States is really so backward in broadband diffusion?
Sure. Much more expensive.
It's worse than in Europe.
Absolutely. Worse than, I don't know Italy's statistics, but certainly worse than France, worse than all of Northern Europe, worse than Britain, worse than Germany. More expensive and slower than those countries. Certainly far worse than Asia. And that's because of bad government policy.
Do you think the future of warfare is the digital warfare, where rather of prisoners of war, there will be hackered servers?
There's no doubt that this is becoming an increasingly important part of warfare, not just warfare between governments, but warfare between non-government entities like terrorist organizations and governments, and warfare among commercial entities and non-commercial entities. These are tools for imposing violence and quite costly violence on other entities. And the sophistication of these tools is only growing. And this is related to the point I made before about the failure of governments to regulate in this context in a way that could have blocked the development of this type of warfare. I think we're vulnerable now in a way we shouldn't have been.
Isn't there a contradiction, and isn't it a difficult balance between wanting the internet free and at the same time wanting the governments to regulate and pass norms which in a way limit the freedom?
Sure. There's a difference between freedom and anarchy. And free societies have always depended upon basic regulation that sets the norms of the society to encourage people to engage in market transactions or to live life in a prosperous way. So I don't want a world where there's no government regulation of the internet. I want a world where there's smart regulation by government on the internet. And regulation is targeted at things that are actually doing harm, like the malicious behavior in the internet, and less regulation of activities that are actually doing good, like, for example, the creative remix of copyrighted work, which is increasingly targeted across the world. So I'm not an anarchist. I'm a believer in liberty and freedom, and those depend upon proper government regulation.
How does politics change in the era of the internet? Is the accounting responsibility real or just virtual?
Well, I don't yet think we have any great example of the internet radically changing politics. We just have a potential. And the reason we don't have a great example is that the generation most connected to the internet is also the generation most apathetic about politics, most cynical about politics. And until that generation recognizes that the power they have using digital technologies to connect people and motivate people could actually be devoted to something good in the context of politics, we're not going to see the kind of revolutionary change that is possible. So I think the infrastructure is there for making that change, but it requires the will of those who know how to deploy it before that change becomes real.